All right. Everyone can hear me, I assume. I don't have to put up the slide about a seance again. Today's lecture will conclude this series of studies on World War I that we began a year ago. And in this particular lecture, I'll spend again the first portion, the first half roughly, on the military aspects with some details that I believe are relevant or important, not only to understanding what happened during 1918, but indeed what set the stage for the conflicts that the world experienced through the rest of the 20th century, and to some extent, even into the 21st, though the dynamics have changed a great deal. The second part will address some of the treaties that were a result of this conflict and set the stage in some ways to what was going to happen in the 20s and 30s and the transition into World War II. Some of the things, as I've said before, may strike you as a little odd or different. Certainly there can be points with which people can disagree, and that's fine. But what I'm doing is trying to create a narrative which I believe will emphasize the dramatic impact World War I has had on all of us, even up to today. The particular title of this section, Some Win, Some Lose, Everybody Loses, seems in itself a form of a paradox. How can it be that some win and some lose, but everybody loses? And part of that is not because of the individual experiences, the tragedies that occurred as a result of the fighting itself, but because ultimately World War I failed to solve anything in and of itself. Remember that at times people described it as the war to end all wars, but at the same time caused a certain transition in what I will call international politics, and addressed in one of the earlier lectures, particularly the rise of ideology. And with the rise of ideology and the shift away from what was traditionally thought to be power politics, there were some dramatic influences on what happened through the rest of the 20th century, and again, up to today. As with things before, I showed this particular slide from The Second Coming of Yeats, and I believe it deserves a great deal of emphasis in itself because it very succinctly encompasses much of what World War I meant and continues to mean, even though most people, particularly in the United States, show very little recognition of the events which occurred. But I think the idea that the center cannot hold, that anarchy is loosed, we actually see some of that happening in our own country over the last several decades. But even more so, if you look across the international stage, and again, I'm going to be expressing my opinion, what I perceive to be a lack of real statesmen. There's a lot of floundering going on in the international arena. And frankly, from again, a perspective I have, the only two people who really seem to know what they're doing are President Xi and President Putin. They seem to know what they want and they seem to know how to get it. To me, everybody else is kind of floundering around, not understanding what it is they really want. And as a result, that raises certain difficulties that can occur almost by accident. And in a way, what happened almost by accident that triggered World War I in the first place. This other issue that's mentioned here, the best lack all conviction, is an interesting paradox in itself, that it provides us with the concept of thinking about what convictions do we have that we assume are held by the best of us. And if no conviction occurs within those people whom we look for leadership, is what we're seeing. And what was seen prior to World War I in particular, that there were no goals or principles upon which people could be matched. They couldn't be held accountable to those things. But that's where the transition to ideology comes in. What we see at this point, at the end of World War I and on through the rest of the 20th century, is the concept that ideology, the truth, the boundaries within which one will operate and make judgments is very well defined. And it's defined by the person or the organization holding those ideas and excluding anything else that might be in against it as either opposition or even criticism. And that leads to this idea of passionate intensity. So I was very impressed as I was reading this poem and then putting it in context of what we're discussing today. Now, I'm sorry about the fuzziness of that one particular slide on the left here. And I realize the print on the right is small, but I don't really care to have anyone read this anyway. The point that I'm trying to make with this is that a lot of things were happening in the political and the military sphere. The joining in of places like Guatemala and Costa Rica and Haiti and Honduras hardly would have any effect on the war. And you'd have to ask yourself, as I mentioned in the last lecture, why you would even bother. What do you hope to gain by doing this? You certainly aren't going to grab any territory. It's not as though that's going to happen. You're not going to really get any resources to the front, so you're not going to gain military experience. And you're not likely to get much foreign aid because all that aid is being managed to support the war as it's going on. So I haven't ever looked into this, but it really puzzled me as to why would you bother? But as I've talked about with each lecture prior to each year, there are certain plans, certain issues that each side had to consider, each nation had to consider. And as we look into this, it gives us a little better understanding of what the decision process was and whether or not these particular decisions made sense in light, not just of the resources available, but in light of the outcome. When we look at the Germans in particular, they had in their particular concept now, with the collapse of Russia, the opportunity to draw much of the resources that had been used on the Eastern Front back to the West. They couldn't abandon the Eastern Front. They had to maintain a military presence, but they could use second and third line troops to do that because it was primarily occupational. But all of those men still had to be supported. So it was only a portion of assets that could be shifted from the West back to from the East back to the West. And in doing so, now there was a great controversy, as there had been in 1916, a great controversy over how to use those resources. It was pretty clear to everyone that Germany's resources were limited. The war had taken an enormous toll, not just in terms of manpower, but also in terms of its ability to continue to conduct the war. Germany was acutely aware of how weak Austria-Hungary was. Despite its landmass, it still found itself, that is, Germany found itself in need of supporting Austria-Hungary. Bulgaria had joined. They needed to do something to assist Bulgaria, which appeared to have few resources. Even added to that was Turkey, which again had limited resources and was now confronting an strengthening British army. So Germany knew that at a certain point, and they were quickly reaching that point, their resources to continue the war were going to be limited. The argument is how best to use those resources. The war at sea, particularly the submarine warfare, was showing that it was failing by the end of 1917. There had been a great bump up in its execution in the early months after the declaration, but over a period of months, as you got into the late summer and fall, it was also becoming increasingly clear that that initiative was failing. So let's break it down into two relatively easy constructs. stay on the defense or go on offense. And there were arguments at the highest levels for both decisions. The idea of the defense was let the Allies wear themselves out in battering against relatively powerful fixed defenses. Those resources brought from the East would serve as reserves, which could help seal or throw back any particular gain that might have occurred when the Allies attacked the Germans. Remember that at this point, the Germans were not on German soil. They were still on French and Belgian soil. So their feeling was they could afford to stand fast, rebuff any major attack, as they had in 1917 with the Nivelle offensive and the British offensive in Flanders, Passchendaele, Third Ypres, and so on. And this would set the stage for Germany to be, if you want to use this word, a sort of partner in negotiations for peace. That makes a lot of sense in many ways. But the other argument, that was to go on the offense, had another element of force to it. Americans were now entering France in increasing numbers. And by the end of 1917, there were nearly 1 million Americans either on French soil being trained or were closely en route, with many more millions being gathered in the United States, brought into camps and given basic training. It appeared that if you stayed on the defense, that the Allies would be able to pick their time and place of attack, and this very large now United States Army eventually would bring such force to bear that Germany would be unable to resist it. Therefore, the best opportunity Germany had to bring the war to its successful conclusion, not victorious in the way of causing the French or British necessarily to surrender, but to force them to the bargaining table, was to attack. Then the question was, attack where and to what end? Attrition was not going to be the answer. There had to be something more strategic. And in that regard, the decision that was finally accepted and appeared to make the most sense to the High Command was to attack the seam between the British and French and drive up to the coast, separating the British and French, causing the British to fall back on the sea coast to protect their ports of entry and supply, and the French to fall back in part to protect Paris. This separation would allow the Germans to force the British into such a situation that they would eventually either sue for peace, but not necessarily as defeated, as well as to batter the French sufficiently and force them onto the defensive that they would be willing also to join in that suit for peace, because they couldn't continue the war without the British. That was very, very clear. The other part then was to figure out how best to do that. And in that regard, it took a great concentration of effort and an enormous amount of planning for that to happen. And it literally took months. That's why the initial attacks didn't take place until March. What this shows is the outline of the major concentration of forces, and the shaded areas show where some of the major gains were taken. We'll discuss that in a little more detail. But it gives you an idea that the distance to the coast is not very great up here. And if you can isolate the British into this, you almost get the sense of what happened in 1940 in World War II when the British were forced back to Dunkirk. The dynamics here are a bit different. What about Italy? Well, again, Austria-Hungary was weak. As I had mentioned in the last lecture, Emperor Karl, who had taken over from Emperor Joseph in 1916, had sought peace because he knew that the resources in his country were limited and he wanted to find a way out of the war. When the peace initiatives failed, now what he had was the Germans who had indicated great support. That led to the offensive that has been titled Caporetto, where the Italians were forced back to the Piave River line and lost nearly 300,000 troops simply as prisoners, and nearly collapsed entirely. The idea was that if the Italians could be pressed further, it wouldn't necessarily force Italy out of the war, but it would ensure the situation available to Austria-Hungary, that if the Germans were successful in their attack, therefore the primary emphasis, that at this particular time, Italy certainly would exit the war as well. Austria-Hungary would be in a better bargaining position. Remember that Serbia had collapsed much earlier. Romania had collapsed shortly after ending the war. And now there were these concentrated troops, primarily British, French, with a mixture of a number of other nations, and later Greece, down in Salonika or Salonika, depending upon how you construct it. So it appeared that there was an opportunity for the Austria-Hungarians to launch another attack. Not that they were going to force the war to a conclusion, but they would simply hold Italy at bay while Italy would wait to see what happened with France and Britain. Now, what about, I've already mentioned a little bit about the Balkans and the area there, but what about the Allied side as it related to the Balkans, the Near East, and the Middle East? Britain had captured Baghdad and they'd captured Jerusalem in December of 1917. Allenby was in charge. There had been a revolt developed in the Arabian Peninsula. T.H. Lawrence, or T.E. Lawrence rather, was the liaison with the Arabs, and they were raiding Turkish lines. But the primary effect there was that Allenby had built up the infrastructure necessary to conduct war against the Turks and drive them out of Palestine, or at least drive them well back. It was pretty clear that Allenby's success opened the door for additional success with a caveat. The caveat was that for the French and the British on the Western Front, and I'll come back to that, demanded resources, and Allenby therefore was a bit shortchanged and actually could do little more in practical terms than sort of hold on to the gains he had until resources could be freed up sufficiently to help him continue his advance against the Turks, which didn't happen until the latter quarter of 1918. In addition, the British were focused more on protecting the oil fields around Basra, and they were also looking further afield with the collapse of Russia towards Baku, because going up to Baku, not only were there oil resources there, but that particular area would cut off from concern any risk to India and to the British hold in the Middle East area. So these were parts of their strategy, but again, their resources were limited. Something was not going to happen immediately. It was going to have to come later. Now, from the Allied side, Salonika, down here, represented well, it had been called a prisoner of war camp, if you will, self-sustaining. But one of the key elements in here was that you had nearly 600,000 troops, a good number of whom were sick, made up of various contingents that we can see listed on this slide. And in a sense, no obvious strategic goal. The best that really could be hoped for would be if sufficient numbers were brought back into a combat readiness You could attack and maybe defeat Bulgaria and begin to threaten the southern flank of Austria-Hungary. But it would be a good distance to travel to go here. And while you could divert resources into this portion of Turkey and perhaps threaten Constantinople, you really didn't have enough concentrated force to be able to do both. So there was still some dynamic involved in how this would all play out, even if these troops were now combat ready, because they also had to be supplied. So there were issues from that standpoint. This shows a little bit of what had been planned way back in 15, but at the same time, it also shows how the British had gained much territory at this point and at this point. So they were making progress. And the idea was, as you can see here, Baku is up over in this area. But if you're driving north, Constantinople's way over here. If you can link up, you'll have chopped off a good part of the Ottoman Empire. This also shows a little bit about, again, in a closer map, what the dynamics were in those particular areas and how much had been accomplished and was yet to be accomplished. Now, in terms of France and Britain, the issues, again, were somewhat similar. Do we muster our forces for yet another attack, or do we recognize the potential that Germany will attack on the Western Front? And indeed, that turned out to be their particular dynamic. Now, there were several elements that underpinned that decision. One was it was felt that the French army had suffered such a loss of morale, as reflected in the mutinies that took place, that even though the army had in a sense been reorganized and reconstructed and rebuilt under Pétain, part of Pétain's philosophy was, we are not going to mount any major offensives until the Americans are on board and we have sufficient supplies and tanks and things of that nature in order to conduct an offensive. In addition, it was felt that there should be more burden placed on the British, whose morale seemed to be holding up quite well. If we shift to Haig, who was in charge of the British army at this time, and indeed Haig, as I think history had indicated, had the largest number of British troops under single command than any British commander in history, and that includes World War II. So he had an enormous responsibility of what to do, but he was hamstrung in part by Lloyd George. During the last lecture, I talked about how Lloyd George had supported Nivelle in conducting the offensive and putting Haig in a subordinate position to Nivelle until the Nivelle offensive failed. But the British casualties suffered during 1917 were still huge. And Lloyd George refused to cull the back areas, to cull England, if you will, of more men. And instead of the nearly 600,000 that Haig felt he would need to rebuild the British army sufficiently, he allowed him only about 100,000. Now, that meant that Haig had to consider what would happen if he tried an offensive. Well, if he's undermanned to begin with, that becomes a no-win situation, because Lloyd George already has told him, by not giving him the replacements that he wishes to have, that he doesn't trust him. So Haig has to say, well, now if I'm on the defensive, what am I going to do? And here's another construct I want us to keep in mind, and it came to me a little while ago when I was thinking about all of this situation. If you're at the, we'll call it the squad level, right? You're in the front line And in your squad, there may be, 10 people. Your platoon is maybe 30, your company 100, your battalion, say 500, and so on as you go up the ladder. Each person who's in charge of each of those different elements not only has more responsibility, more managerial responsibility, to put it in simple terms, but he also has to think further out. So if you're dealing with a squad, you're thinking in terms of seconds or minutes. If you're a platoon, you might be thinking in terms of minutes. If you're a company, you might be thinking in terms of an hour or maybe 2, and so on and so forth as you work your way up the ladder. Well, as you get to the senior positions, such as Haig has, he's now thinking not just of days, but of weeks and even months, because it's up to him to bring all those resources to bear that allow something to happen. And the best example I can give in a simple way is to say, if you're going to launch a major offensive, you may need up to 4 or 5 million artillery shells. Well, they don't come overnight. You have to be thinking well in advance in order to have that happen. Just as when I talked about the digging of mines at Messines, that took months. So the senior generals have to be planning that far in advance to figure out how it's all going to come together. So Haig is looking at this, transitioning into 1918. And what he's saying is, if I'm going to be on the defensive, then I have to prepare the rear areas, and I have to find a way to make up for this shortfall in replacements. And what Haig did was he reorganized the British Army. Instead of having, I think it was 4 battalions per regiment, he went to 3, but that meant 1 battalion got shifted over to another unit. So they were dealing with a new parent, if we'll call it that, and they had to be integrated properly. He had to build new rail systems in order to provide the forward movement of supplies. He had to think more in depth of defense. How far back are we willing to go when we meet this onslaught from Germany? Because it's not likely we're going to hold on to the front lines in a static way. All of that took preparation. And unfortunately for the British, in a way, and for the French, they were sort of caught mid-step when the fighting actually broke out. The French, similarly, as I'd referred to earlier, had a similar issue. They knew that they were not capable at this particular stage of conducting a major offensive. They had recognized the transition of troops from the east to the Western Front on the part of Germany. They recognized the real potential for an attack, and then they tried to prepare themselves for it. Now, all of that's all well and good, but I'm going to shift back to Germany, and then we're going to get into the battles. The German approach to the offensive was not same old, same old. And most of the time when people are thinking about World War I, they think about trench warfare, going over the top, getting blown up by artillery. 75% of casualties were inflicted by artillery, 75%. And machine gun fire and things of that sort. The Germans, remember, did not develop much in the way of tanks. They had a few. But in no particular battle did they have the kinds of numbers that eventually the French and the British had. So how are they going to launch a major offensive and break through these trench lines and exploit to the distance required that I showed on an earlier map of maybe 20 to 30 miles of penetration to get to the coast? All experiences up to that time where someone tried to breach those kinds of defensive lines had shown excessive casualties with very little gain. What was going to be different? Well, I had mentioned this in the last lecture based on experiences on the Eastern Front, and in particular, an attack that took place in the very northern portion of the Eastern Front around the city of Riga. And in that particular situation, which exemplified this new form of warfare the Germans were about to use on the Western Front, a fellow named Bruckmüller and his senior commander Hertier had found what could best be described as the key to unlocking the trenches. It had involved a very different approach to warfare. It involved an intense, what was called a hurricane bombardment, exceptionally well organized, to such an extent that there was this massive amount of fire that was laid out in very carefully described plans that would allow suppression, not destruction, of the enemy trench system and its supporting artillery. It involved a high proportion of gas used primarily against the artillery and also on the flanks to almost literally try to seal off the area of the main attack. And in addition, we've heard this term perhaps, if you're familiar with World War I, Sosstruppen, these special shock troops that were trained and equipped to breach the front line. But in breaching the front line, they would exploit only through weak points. Any strong points that were left behind were to be bypassed. And these troops, which are proceeding on foot, all right, there's no mechanization involved here. They don't have horses with them to speak of. It's walking. But they're going to breach this front line. They're going to bypass these strong points, and they're going to get further into the depths of the defense where they can either directly attack artillery, or they can disrupt supply areas, and they can disrupt headquarters and communications to the front. Now, what about those strong points they bypassed? A second level of engagement would occur from reserves that were brought up behind them. And they would spend time reducing those strong points, and that would open the breach more widely and allowed exploitation. What about the hurricane bombardment? Well, the interesting part about organization there was that there would be an attempt to avoid disrupting the ground to the degree that had been present when bombardments were used for days or even weeks. Therefore, the ground would be less churned up, but the hurricane bombardment would certainly do a lot of damage. But it would at least give some impetus to bringing forward smaller artillery pieces, which could, as they move forward, provide some additional support to the advancing soldiers. Now, the problem with this approach was its durability over distance. And that's where additional planning had to be initiated. But this particular concept of warfare was something quite special and had not been experienced except on the Eastern Front in a few locales, and particularly Riga. Now the question was it going to be successful? Now, this particular slide, for example, shows that when you breach the front line and you penetrate deeply enough, you begin to start uncovering all of these sources of communication and supply, the rail lines that you need in order to move things forward, but you also begin to get these supply dumps. And also you begin to overrun some of the headquarters. And if you don't overrun them, they have to displace. And if they displace, they give up communication. So this severing of the head from the body, if you will, plus the disruption of supplies, taking dumps and cutting supply lines, would render the front line weak and actually create a great deal of fear that they're going to be cut off, surrounded, and either annihilated or captured. This shows in part the production that was going on in England. And I show this because it's valuable just to get a sense of what was happening other than in the front line. Where did the resources come from? How were they addressed? And as you can see just from the nature of this slide, that there was an enormous amount of activity in England gathered to support the war. These are the critical sites here. The front line is really just not very far away. And that the English Channel, fortunately, had been largely cleaned of enemy submarines. Though if we look back at a slide from the end of my last lecture, you'll see how many ships were sunk in the English Channel during 1917. But this also shows where all the importation is coming from. Now, in the particular setup that was going on, particularly where the main German offensive would occur, the idea was that the Germans found themselves not too far in the front line, not too far from these major ports. Therefore, if they broke through the British line and they could exploit, just think about even getting to Hazebrouck, okay? You've disrupted the major supply lines that are going to support this whole section of the front. And if this collapses, then getting supplies across the road network through here is not going to be that simple. And the troops are going to need to fall back and protect these areas. This gives an idea of what Haig was trying to do when I spoke earlier about building the infrastructure. And again, it emphasizes the particular risks or dangers that would come to the British if the Germans were successful in their assault. The Germans are here, the British trenches are here, no man's land, as you see. These thin lines represent little tramways, you know, almost where you could have a cart from a railhead and you could load, say, 500 or 600 or 700 pounds on the cart and you could run it down these railways in order to get it to the trenches. But now if you break through, and here's an example of the legend of distance, right? 2,000 yards, it's a little over a mile. Pretty soon you're disrupting all of this. And then these represent supply areas, ammunition depots, and where you would park vehicles. And remember that still a good deal of transportation was conducted by horses, pulling wagons, pulling artillery, and so on. And when you broke into this area, the artillery is back here as well. They're not that close to the front line. They're going to be back here. So again, to emphasize the complexity, the Germans looked to suppress the artillery, which is back here in support, put a hurricane fire down here to break up this area and the ability of the defenders to come out of their dugouts and defend. And they're going to send in their stormtroopers, bypassing difficult redoubts or fixed defenses and penetrating to disrupt all of this. It's a very enormously complex plan. And this gives you an idea when the offensive breaks out, and there are actually 5 different attacks the Germans conduct, most of which is gathered under the name Operation Michael, but actually there are 5 segments to it, and a 6th that was supposed to happen and didn't. But look at this, 3.2 million shells fired on day 1. That's extraordinary. And you don't bring that onto the stage without a lot of planning and a lot of infrastructure support. 68 divisions. When this attack broke out, the British took 50,000 casualties on day 1. Now, at the Battle of the Somme, 1916, the British took 60,000 casualties on day 1. So this is comparable to that. In addition, the ground gained was considerable, but the British were able to hold on to a couple of critical spots which deflected the Germans away. In fact, in the original planning, the main thrust was to be conducted more to the north than here. I think this was the 18th German Army, not that we care about that particularly. They were supposed to just be a supporting role, and the main attack was to drive through here. But this was stopped relatively cold in spite of the planning, and there's some reasons why that happened due to the way the commander of that German army failed to incorporate some of those lessons that had been instilled in the 18th Army with this experience from Hertier and Bruckmüller. Reinforcing success led the Germans, and particularly Ludendorff, who was really the person in charge of this, and it's sometimes been called the Ludendorff Offensive, to create another operation, Operation Mars, where he was going to try to force this issue towards Arras, disrupt one of the main supply routes, and see if he could continue the penetration towards the coast. But when he did this, he shifted the initiative of support that had been planned initially for Operation Michael. As a result, there was a fair amount of confusion that took place. Some resources didn't get to where they were supposed to get. And these details, while they sound a little bit picky, go to the heart of what it means to lead an offensive and to lose your strategic focus. What was happening was Ludendorff was now, in a sense, going after the shiny object on the floor, rather than seeing where the major initiatives had to be continued. He lost that strategic focus. In addition, though, and to give great credit to Pétain in particular on this, is that Pétain sent a fair number of French divisions north in order to give Haig some resources he could use to try to blunt the German attacks. Now, this was at his own risk because it meant he had fewer resources down where the Germans were going to attack again, unbeknownst to him. He thought the effort was going to continue up here. But in that regard, he was willing to take a risk. Now, his army was still going to be primarily focused on defense, but he was there and willing to support the British in order to keep link with them so that the front wouldn't be ruptured entirely and the two armies separated, but also to show his willingness to engage with Haig. And they had had their arguments over the previous year. With this failure of Operation Mars to achieve much more, but with the expansion that could be seen further south, Ludendorff again shifted the force of the attack further to the south. His intent was to threaten, but not worry about. He wasn't actually targeting Paris, but to threaten it in such a way that the French reserves, which had been sent to support the British, would now be pulled back. And if they're pulled back, then he would again try to shift his emphasis back up to the north. But he made great success here. They actually breached through a good part of the attack and made progress at the Chemin des Dames. And this had been a place of great fighting in 1917 as well. Part of the Nivelle offensive took place through this area. But now the Germans, with their particular approach that I've discussed earlier, breached this line and drove the French back in a really almost catastrophic defeat for the French. And part of the reason for that was the French general who was in charge of this area had ignored the principles which he was encouraged to use to have the front line manned weakly, let the bombardment hit the front line but not take casualties, and to, in a sense, have a more elastic defense. Instead, he put a lot of troops in that front line. They got pummeled to pieces. And when the Germans attacked, they breached the ridge line of Chemin de Dam and crossed the Aisne River. This led to a developing area here, this bulge that you're seeing, and it began to isolate because of the disruption of a communication line that passed through this area, began to separate parts of the French army. Now, Ludendorff again thought, whoa, this is turning into something better than I expected. But I have a problem. At Reims and at Chateau-Thierry area here, and Compiègne, which is not shown well here, I don't believe. No, it's probably buried in this dots. He wanted to take Reims in order to open a rail line, which existed right along this particular area here, which would improve the supplies that could be brought forward to the German forces. In this area here, separate of this rail line, if this wasn't open, the road network was poor. So he felt that he could attack here and attack there in order to try to break this hold that the French maintained at Reims in particular on the rail line and open this to supply. Both of those attacks failed. So as you can see over here, there had been great gains. And indeed, you remember about the famous German railgun that lobbed shells 70 miles into Paris. That was a consequence of them getting this territory open. The point was that nothing of strategic value had been gained. But as I also mentioned during the previous lectures, this represented an enormous change in the front line. Prior to this, through pretty much all of 1915, 16, and 17, the front line had shifted very little, except for the voluntary withdrawal the Germans performed back to the Hindenburg line prior to the Nivelle offensive. These kinds of gains were unheard of on the Western Front and appeared to be catastrophic. It appeared on the surface that the British and the French had collapsed. The trench lines were now gone. They'd all been here. There was nothing back here. So you think, how is it that this didn't end the war? Well, it didn't for a couple of reasons. One, I alluded to earlier. The Germans had exhausted themselves because they had to walk this distance, and their frontline troops had to be supplied with ammunition and food, water, replacements. The casualties on both sides were enormous, literally hundreds of thousands in this particular time frame from March through July. But at the same time, that weakening of combat power meant that these gains did nothing in particular to threaten the viability of the French or the British to stay in the fight. Germany was exhausting itself. And particularly down here is what was called the Second Battle of the Marne later on, when the French and Americans launched an offensive. The Americans were now beginning to show themselves to be at least combat ready, though not combat experienced. So the important part was that Ludendorff, and I think deserves some criticism in this regard, failed to stick to his strategic plan and instead chased after the gains that he had made in the ground area by distance, but never accomplished anything of strategic importance. The vital areas were all still with the French and the British under their control. And despite the apparent threat to Paris, Ludendorff actually did not have an interest in trying to take Paris. He wasn't about to go there. So this was one of the main things that happened that began to turn this whole conflict. Now, what is dramatic and impressive about this, and is often forgotten again in good measure by all of us in reading about World War I, is just how dramatic the turnaround was at this point. Not only had the British and the French taken a huge hit in terms of casualties, disruption of supplies, overrun their artillery batteries and captured prisoners and all the rest of it, but they very quickly transitioned to the offensive. And this in itself was an incredible achievement. It's one that I think deserves great emphasis at this particular point. And the transition to the offensive was not because they had a lot of tanks, though they were building them and they were going to use them, but because they had developed a doctrine and training and experience that allowed them to make this transition, and within a short period of time, begin to regain all of this lost territories. Now, coupled with that was the recognition on the part of the German high command that nothing of strategic importance had been gained. And as a result, particularly in this area, which crossed the Marne River and was near the Chemin des Dames and so on that I've talked about earlier, is they recognized that when they could not take Reims and they couldn't open the rail line, that their best action was to get themselves out of here. So they were actually beginning to withdraw when the Americans and French, and it was primarily a French effect. The Americans were there, we contributed, but the primary fighting was done by the French, was also a matter of just chasing after the Germans because they were already on their way back. This is another dramatic map that shows more of the front, and I point this area out as the Saint-Mihiel salient and the Meuse-Argonne region here, which is going to be a site which has been revered in American military history, though again, importantly, of no particular strategic consequence. That is, no particular strategic goal was achieved unless it was to give the Americans battle experience under their own commanders as an army. The Americans had been prevailed upon by both the British and French from the very moment they first set foot in France to separate their units and embed them with the British and French to gain better experience. And in particular, to have the French and British officers train American officers in how to conduct the war, how to conduct fighting. Pershing had resisted that for a lot of reasons. And when the Germans made their great initiative and began to drive down here, the French leaders, Foch, Pétain, Haig, and others, as well as the political leaders, prevailed heavily on Pershing to get into the fight, even to the point of sending units to join as regiments in French or British divisions. Haig was willing to do what he could, but with a very limited time frame because he was very fearful of losing control of his units. So his resistance from the standpoint of the French and British was almost as though, you're going to let us collapse so you can maintain an army? What good are you if we collapse? In addition, if Pershing wasn't willing to help get into the fight immediately, then why would the French and British continue to give them resources? Because all of the artillery, most of the machine guns, if not nearly all of them, and all of their airplanes, and certainly all of their tanks, were given to them by the British and French. If you're not going to use them, we will, quite frankly. So there's a lot of give and take that was required. And the Americans were able to join in order to help reduce the effects, particularly in this area of the Marne, and then to reconsolidate in order to deal with this area down here. Operation Georgette was called that because Operation George was the initial operation on which Ludendorff was focused as the follow-on to Michael. And it was just to show that the penetration was to get to the important rail lines and supply areas in the region. And again, he wasn't successful. When we look at the major effect, again, I show these slides repeatedly because I think it's important to understand the counteroffensives that took place, the blue being the French, the red being the British, and so on. And these are the Americans down through here, although we don't show this one, was to drive the Germans back to the Hindenburg line and then in time breach it. And these particular attacks were of great importance to demonstrating to the Germans basically that they were just not going to win this fight at all. This is where the Saint-Mihiel salient took place. The Americans were here. Their first army attacked in this direction. The French attacked from this direction, drove the British back, but they were actually, again, in the process of withdrawing. They recognized the dangers involved in this, and they weren't about to hold it. This was nothing important. The Americans did well in this particular drive, and after a few days, once the line stiffened up, and the Americans could not accomplish some of the goals that were set, but they nonetheless performed reasonably well, was to join the French and attack in this direction along the Meuse-Argonne. And when the Americans got into this, they really ran into a Donnybrook. So we were able eventually with the French, we never fought entirely by ourselves, but we fought as a unified army. When we got into this area, we took a beating and our casualty rates escalated enormously, partly because of the nature of the terrain and partly because of the lack of experience we had. The counteroffensives that were launched, as you look up here, finally had caused Foch to be put in supreme command. When the British and the French struggled in March, there was still no senior commander in charge of the entire set of armies. And this lack of unified command prevented direct administration of orders to various army commanders, group commanders, and so on, to do things. You had to negotiate everything. Foch was put in charge as the supreme commander, and this gave him the authority to order things to happen. But he also had beneath him now very experienced people who knew what they wanted to do and how to do it. And as a result, there were a number of different attacks that took place. This is the Saint-Mihiel here. This is the collapse of the attacks near the Marne, driving them back, even though the Germans were retreating at this point, but they weren't retreating at this point. And these attacks now showed great success. And this, again, was not due because there was high mechanization. Yes, there were times that a great many tanks were used, but as been the experience previously in this fighting, the tanks generally got a little ways into the front lines or beyond, but often broke down or were shot up because they really were not sufficient to make deep penetrations. And if they were separated from the infantry, they became real targets. This, again, is just a matter of recovering the miracle of the Marne, the second miracle, if you want to call it that, and so on. I'm not going to dwell on these particular things because I've talked about them. But what I want to show you here is just in terms of losses that occurred. This was a bitter, brutal fight that's going on. And despite all these losses, the Allies were able to muster the troops and resources necessary for a counteroffensive, which began shortly after the German advances had stopped. Now, we are coming up on an hour, and I just want to finish off the Western Front because the other part I can hold off on. The idea was that, particularly in August, as we transition in, the British attacked, And the Germans quite literally collapsed at that point. It was called the Black Day for the German army by Ludendorff. And it was at that point that Ludendorff felt the war was lost. So even though the war didn't end until the armistice in November, Ludendorff had already, in a sense, given up winning. And this is an important element that often is talked about in warfare, and that is that you defeat the army's morale, you defeat the mind of the opposite commander. And when you've done that, then the game's over, so to speak. The accomplishments, the counteroffensive covered an enormous amount of territory, and most importantly, not only drove the Germans out of most of France and even a good part of Belgium, but had breached the Hindenburg line. And past that, Germany had no major fixed defenses. So
Right.
once their army showed it was collapsing, it just meant there was no way that Ludendorff and Hindenburg felt they could stop further advance.
Break time.
I'll just show this and we'll stop here and come back after a few minutes. We'll finish up the military part and talk about the treaties, and I'll try to save a few minutes later on to conclude everything. If anyone has questions, be happy to answer them. So Henry, I saw you
Yes.
threw your hands up at one point in my introduction. Was that in distress? Distress?
No, there was something I was disagreeing with. What were you talking about at the time?
Well, talking about the triumph of ideology and how the political centers were falling apart, the lack of any real statesmen, at least in terms of my own judgment, and that currently it seems President Xi and Putin are the ones who seem to know best what they're doing.
That was what I was going to object.
Well, object. What's your feeling?
For them to know what they're doing because they do what they want to do, and there's no opposition or serious opposition that they can't control, and that's the opposite of our ideology, which is to let everybody have a say in things, and it slows it all down.
Yeah,
it makes it look weak, but it isn't necessarily.
No, I agree with that. I think the issue that
I'm sure you do, otherwise you'd be called a traitor.
Well, that's for sure. Absolutely. To maybe put a little different spin on it is not to weigh their particular activities as better, because I think there are many drawbacks to it. But that if you were to say, what is it you wish to accomplish? And are you working with a focus to accomplishing that? I would say they're clear about their strategic goals. I'll use Xi as an example with, controlling the South China Sea as an example.
Yeah,
I would use Putin as controlling the Crimea in eastern Ukraine
yeah,
and saying,
sure.
we're willing to push the envelope pretty hard to get that, because our perception is nobody's really going to stop us. Now, whether they do what has been done by dictators or oligarchs in the past, and that is push too far, is yet to be seen. But it's the kind of thing that, if you look at just the idea of what do we want and how are we willing to get it, it seems they're more efficient. I'll put it that way.
Well, it's easy for them to be more efficient. They don't have any opposition to it. That's the point. And,
Yeah.
and basically, there's a very different approach to reaching a goal. You set a goal in the West and in democratic states as something that you advertise as much as you can, and you do as much as you also can to persuade those who would oppose it to either back down or to join you. You can't lick them, join them kind of thing.
Right.
And it takes a much greater effort on the one hand, and a much different manipulation of those who you wish to have support you. Whereas in the East, either China or the Soviet Union, if anybody gets in the way, well, you just knock them out of the way. You kill them, you do whatever you need to do, you jail them,
Right.
and you completely have suppressed any opposition. So having your goal in getting there is only hindered by sort of kind of physical opposition that you have to, like an engineer has to overcome, and a little creativity doesn't hurt there to do it. I mean, a good example is the Chinese in the South China Sea, literally making air bases out of atolls, or whatever you want to call them. They're not even that. They're just sand sticking up out of the sea that shows you there's enough with a bulldozer that you can turn into something that's militarily useful.
Right.
That's all that stops them. Now, we don't want them to have it, but we're not going to go to war over a piece of sand like that unless they start really using it against, say, the Philippines or Japan, or intimidating shipping through that area. And we've already done pretty well by sending in our own rather powerful Navy, which is our tool for keeping them back. So I really don't think it's a fair comparison or even contrast. Well, it is a contrast to say that.
Yeah, well, again, you and I could certainly have a long discussion about that. But I think most of our people are back. So I'm going to resume the lecture. Are you going to mute everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Done? Okay. As we'll see, the final battles that took place on the Western Front, as I've outlined before, were really extraordinary. The back and forth, the terrain taken and lost during the course of these battles through 1918 was just unheard of in the previous parts of the war, and generally indicated the resiliency of the Allies and the engagement of the Americans, though I would emphasize, in my view, the American contribution, while important, was not of enormous significance. The vast gains, which basically turned the war against Germany and led to Germany seeking an armistice, was conducted by the British and by the French. These particular slides just show the complicated nature of planning. They're not designed to reflect anything particular unless you have those kinds of interests. And to just show that when you're organizing an attack, you've got a lot of things to think about. This is what I meant in terms of as you go higher up the ladder, your time frame for engagement goes out further and further. And it again shows how complex warfare became in this particular part of World War I. Now, as these salients were reduced and the Germans were thrown back, they lost the Hindenburg line. And when they lost that, they had no other resources behind them. Once that began to happen, it appeared that it was going to be an unending conflict that would force the Germans all the way back, perhaps to the Rhine River. And this was unacceptable to them. As things collapsed for them, as you see these lines being forced back, the decision was made, we need to call a halt to this conflict before we're on German soil. It wasn't so much that they feared destruction as would happen, is that there was no point to it from the German standpoint. And if they could convince the Allies to have an armistice, at least they would save their own territory from being a battleground. And indeed, that happened. I show this slide because here's the American contribution. Okay. So much as we hear about the Meuse-Argonne and the Saint-Mihiel or the Second Battle of the Marne, we really did not play a big role in this. And again, these slides show that there were a series of Allied offensives which broke the back of the German army. There was one place, I like to show this, even though this is a very small section of the front, because this particular area at Blanc-Mont, not Mont Blanc, which is the ski area, had been attacked on a number of occasions in the preceding wars, and it was considered by the Allies and by the French, on whose front it was, as you just couldn't take it. And the Americans took it. So it was a good example that the vitality of this young American army could achieve something which had not been achieved over the period of several years. And I show this because this is the terrain. You think, well, there's a mountain here somewhere. Where is it? And you don't see it. And the point is that these small folds and in the ground that you see actually were of enormous tactical significance because of the view that they would give you over the battlefield. So it's a dramatic opposition to the way we think about these things. American soldiers, British soldiers, and so on, all congregating and looking for the end of the war and really being pretty happy that things are coming. This is just a slide to show the reduction of the Saint-Mihiel salient. The Americans are down here, the French are here. There's an American unit coming in through here. But basically, they were to go all the way up to here and never got there. Meuse-Argonne is off in this area. Again, you'll see that the offensive going on through there where the Americans are driving up in this direction and the French from here. Bitter fighting occurs. I showed this slide because when the armistice is drawn, this is where the front line is. But these areas here represent what will be some of the terms of the armistice and eventually of the Treaty of Versailles. Now I'm going to cover this next area fairly quickly because the real issue was that the war was decided on the Western Front. When Germany was collapsing, what was happening elsewhere, success or failure, had little to do with the ultimate end of the war. It contributed, but loss of Germany in this meant the end of the conflict. And this was indeed something that took place primarily in the Near East, the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, And then I mentioned this area down here. The Balkans, the Allies finally broke out of Salonika and very quickly were able to penetrate the Bulgarian defenses, some of the Austro-Hungarian defenses, and could exploit beyond, eventually capturing a number of the very significant cities, and then driving even further north, basically against no opposition, because everything had been concentrated down here. And once this was breached, it was open season further on. And this is one of the key elements that happened with static warfare. In the back, if you weren't prepared, everything was open. On the Italian front, as we had talked about, Caporetto had led to the Austria-Hungarian-German combination to drive the Italians back to the Piave River line. The Austrians attacked in order to hold the Italians in place. They gained very little. And then in return, as they gained very little, you can see here, the counteroffensive that developed again reclaimed much of the line that was lost in Caporetto. The Austrians retreated in great numbers. And as with the Italians in Caporetto losing nearly 300,000 prisoners, the same was true for the Austrians. They lost a comparable number. This is occurring at the same time that Germany is being beaten in France. So it's October-November timeframe. And at the end of October, Austria-Hungary says, I've had enough. To emphasize the difficult nature of fighting in Italy, particularly in the Alp region, I'd like these slides just to show these photographs just how difficult things were. I mean, I find it hard to imagine that people are doing this. And in the meantime, able to maintain supplies and some fighting ability. What about in the Ottoman Empire? Well, that finally collapses as well. Allenby, after the initial successes that occur on the Western Front, is now able to gather supplies and reinforcements and again to attack the Ottomans and drive them basically out of most of all of what we now know as modern Israel, Lebanon, and into Syria, go to Damascus, and so on. And in Mesopotamia, they drive north from Baghdad, and they're able to reach up towards Baku, which is over in this upper right corner, forcing the Turks, who had temporarily taken it when the Russians went out of the war, to retreat. So they had protected this area that they wanted up there. This is the Allenby final attack in mid-September 1918. This basically forces the Ottomans to sue for peace as well. So everywhere the Central Powers are collapsing within the final months of the war. There is also fighting in Africa, and I mention this because it's just an interesting sidelight. This particular fellow, Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck, had led a small German contingent throughout the entire war against the British and native troops whom the British co-opted into joining them, such that he had at the end he started out with about 14,000, he ended up with about 5,000, but he had forced the Allies to commit over 200,000 troops to run him down, and another 1 million in support duties, many of whom were conscripts, natives, who were co-opted into providing logistical support. But the important part was he ran around this area for the entire war, and in fact didn't surrender until the 25th of November, when he finally learned that Germany had signed an armistice. The war at sea similarly was reaching a pinnacle, as you see that the losses to German submarines had begun to decline enormously, and the losses of German submarines had begun to escalate considerably, and the number of ships that were making it into English and French ports had increased markedly. The German Navy had promulgated an idea that they would have sort of one last suicidal charge into the North Sea and take on the British Navy and go down with honor, if you will, at which point the German sailors mutinied, said, we're not going out there. The war's coming to an end. Why should we go out and die? Instead, the German fleet was to be sailed to England, to Scapa Flow, and was to be interred. But when they arrived, the Germans basically scuttled all of their ships in Scapa Flow. So the British didn't really gain anything from that. I had shown this earlier in the lecture series. The point I'm trying to make is that the United States, while it was an industrial power, actually contributed little materially other than manpower and financial resources and a fair amount of ammunition to the conflict as a whole. We certainly didn't build much, and we built practically no artillery weapons, no airplanes, and very few ships. The air war had reached a new pinnacle of engagement with proper integration between the various services. This integration served as a pathway for what would come in later years, and in particular manifested by what we've heard as a term called blitzkrieg. This proper integration had its genesis in World War I, and many theories about the use of air power were studied during the course of the next 20 years. In terms of the joy at the end of the war, certainly it was magnificent. All around the world, people were beginning to celebrate the armistice. But remember, the armistice was simply a way of ending the fighting. It actually hadn't established peace. But what is impressive about this are the crowds that you see generated out to welcome the end of the war. And in particular, Black troops who had been welcomed by the French and treated well by the French during World War I, when they returned back to the United States, went back into a severely segregated society and their rights severely restricted. It's one of those paradoxes that they had felt welcomed and treated well in another country compared to their own. It's not one of our better elements. I showed a portion of this slide earlier. As part of the armistice, the British, French, and Americans would occupy bridgeheads across the Rhine River. This was in order to ensure Germany's compliance with whatever was going to come in terms of the armistice and the subsequent treaty. One thing I haven't talked about, and I won't go into at any length at all, is the flu epidemic of 1917-18. This gives you an example of the profound effect. All of the armies were affected by it. All of them suffered as a result of it. It may have had a greater influence in certain areas than others, but none of the histories I reviewed indicated that in and of itself had a lot to do with the collapse of Germany or Austria-Hungary. I think their collapses were due to other reasons. You'll notice the wide number of estimates, between 15 and 100 million worldwide. This again was an extraordinary outbreak. It turned out, I think, in not too many years ago that a corpse had been found in Alaska, and they were able to isolate some of the virus and found that it was an avian virus. That meant transmittable easily through respiratory droplets. It actually may have started in the United States, though it was called the Spanish flu because some of the first reports came from there. These are electron micrographs. And this shows how packed some of the hospital wards were. This is all flu victims. Hit the young particularly hard compared to the elderly. And like our seasonal flu, which hits the infants and younger people harder than it does the older, It's quite different from the coronavirus, which is hitting the elderly and those with other immune deficiencies. I show this because masks halt the spread. None of them talked about flattening the curve. None of them talked about 2 weeks. Notice over here the symptoms that you could look for. I just found it very interesting to see that and realize that, you know, here at literally almost 100 years ago, they were dealing with this, and now here we are, and we've got some of the same initiatives that we're looking at trying to protect ourselves. The armistice of Salonika, I've got to just do one quick thing here. Sorry, hang on 1 second. I'm sorry. Just got to move this. There we go. Bulgaria decides we're out of the fight in September 29. The reason I show this is that the armistice had certain requirements that were going on. Look at this, 150,000 Belgian soldiers to be held as hostages. So you don't behave, we got these people. Now, down here, they're going to lose some territory. It's not huge, but it's there. And notice this indemnity. Now, this doesn't sound like a great deal, perhaps 5.7 billion. The way we're throwing the number trillions around is sort of staggering. It's like, I'm trying to remember which senator it was who said, you know, you talk about billions and pretty soon you're talking about real money. Well, anyway, the thing to look at is not so much what it means in terms of dollars today, but what it would purchase back then in its comparison with the GDP. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we come to the Treaty of Versailles. The armistice with Austria-Hungary is on November 3rd. So you can see the 29th of September. You see this November 3rd. The armistice with Germany is November 11th. And notice again some of the terms. Austria-Hungary allowed the transit of Triple Entente armies to reach Germany from the south. Germany had not surrendered at this point, but it basically was another way of saying to Germany, you're done. Because once we're through here, you've got no defense. You're over. What about the Ottoman Empire? October 30, 1918, Treaty of Mudros. Okay. Demobilize your army, release all prisoner of wars, forts open to occupation. And the Dardanelles, I should put an S in there, and Bosphorus are going to be open to Allied warships, means they're going to the Black Sea. Evacuate your Arab provinces. Kind of interesting. Now, this just shows, in a way, some of the territory that's being yielded up to the Allies. And one of the things this generates in the Ottoman Empire, now going to just be Turkey, it's no longer an empire, basically, is that it's going to create a resurgence of Turkish nationalism, which is going to lead to some very intense and bitter and brutal fighting in the subsequent years. We'll come to that later. What about in Germany? Well, November 11th, the armistice is signed. Remember, all of this is just designed to end the fighting, but it hasn't settled the war. The rail car at Compiègne, when France surrendered in World War II in 1940, Hitler sat in the same chair as Foch. Foch left the deliberations, leaving it to surrogates to outline the armistice terms with the Germans. This was an insult, if you will, to the Germans and re-emphasized to them that they had lost the war. So Hitler did the same thing back in 1940. The armistice terms, I'm going to show this to you because this is important. All loot to be returned to appropriate countries. All submarines to be turned over to the Allies. Repatriation of all displaced persons. Surrender of military equipment, and so on and so forth. All of this was just designed to put Germany in a position where it was powerless. Now, what about the treaty itself? Not signed until June 28. So you have over 6 months, 7 months, during which there is simply a cessation of fighting, but the war is not over. And indeed, as I mentioned in the last lecture, the Allies maintained a blockade on Germany, restricting the importation of foodstuffs. And it's alleged that this continued blockade caused a great many deaths from starvation. It's an interesting way of thinking about what's going on in this particular time frame. The celebration on November 11th, as we who are old enough recall, used to be called Armistice Day, and then it became Veterans Day. But the point was that the war had not finished. When the treaty was created, Germany was simply informed of the results. Notice that it's 240 pages long. And this particular change established a lot of different elements that fed into the narrative that's been offered by a number of historians that the Treaty of Versailles didn't really end the war, it merely set the stage for the next one. I have some disagreement with that, but I think that it was certainly a powerful influence on what happened in Germany after the war had finally concluded. Territorial losses. Well, Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. Well, Alsace-Lorraine had traded back and forth literally for centuries between the Holy Roman Empire, the German Empire, the French Empire, back and forth, back and forth. So that loss in itself was not a particular critical issue that hurt Germany as such. It surrendered some German territory to Belgium, but it was really of no major consequence. The occupation of the Saar was simply that, an occupation. The occupation of German territory, the sort of demilitarized zone on the west bank of the Rhine River, was simply designed to prevent Germany from remilitarizing, developing a strong defense line between itself and France. That was really just to inhibit the idea that Germany would be resurgent. Germany and Austria not to reunite. Well, fine, we know how that turned out. The Sudetenland, overwhelmingly German, was given to Czechoslovakia. Now, part of the reason for that, when you say that Wilson was looking at ethnic groupings as important to the integrity of a nation, why would anyone agree to put the Sudeten Germans into another country? It had to do with the territory they occupied. The Sudetenland had great defensive potential. And indeed, Czechoslovakia, over the 20 years roughly of its existence before it was swallowed up by Germany, had defended that area and created a number of fortifications which were important to its existence. Once the Munich Agreement occurred and the Sudetenland was returned to Germany because of its high ethnic population of Germans, Czechoslovakia basically had no defensible borders. German port cities on the Baltic given to Poland, which severed Prussia from the rest of Germany. That was a sticking point that was of great importance, particularly with the rise of Hitler. That would be talked about if we ever had got to those points. And Germany lost her colonies, which really weren't that important anyway. So you ask yourself, what mattered to Germany that pissed them off so much that it served as the basis for World War II? I think when you look at these details, you find not too much yet, not too much that couldn't be fixed. 100,000 volunteer troops, surface Navy minimal, can't have tanks, can't have certain kinds of artillery, so on and so forth, can't have any U-boats, can't have an Air Force. They got around that. We won't talk about that here. Economic and financial obligations. This is of greater significance. And again, when we look at this, 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to $423 billion in 2019 dollars, But look at the GDP of Germany in 1918. This amount was greater than the GDP. So equivalent today, if you look at Germany's GDP of $3,700 billion, think of that. The victorious power saying, you owe us the equivalent of your GDP. You know, for the United States, you owe us $17 trillion for all the damage you've done. And they were going to occupy German territory until that indemnity was paid. I think that's a better way of looking at what the money means than trying to translate it into current dollars. The treaty that was finally established with Austria was probably the harshest of all of them. If anybody was going to be really angry about the results of the treaties, look at what happens to Austria. It's basically dismembered, broken up into a whole lot of other countries, of which Austria is very small. They've lost territory to Italy. They've lost it to the creation of Czechoslovakia. They've lost it to Poland. They've lost it to Serbia, Montenegro, and so on, Yugoslavia, as it turns out. And yet, Austria remained very pacific until it became part of the German Reich. What about Bulgaria? I already showed a little bit of this slide earlier, saddled with an indemnity, restricted forces. They lost their outlet to the Aegean, but they'd still had the Black Sea. But then again, the Turks still controlled the Dardanelles. Now, the Kingdom of Austria signed one treaty. The Kingdom of Hungary forms itself and is dissolved as a separate entity. That is, it's separated from Austria and becomes its own entity. And again, weak, but ethnically more homogeneous, since the ethnic groupings that are all in here are broken up. What about the Ottoman Empire? I showed this slide before: occupation, influence, and so on. Who is going to get control of what? I need to move something here. You'll notice that over here, even the Armenians had a little bit of a slot where they could put themselves together. And the French and the Italians to some extent, and the Greeks even more so, all had a place, a little piece of this they wanted to take. And the Ottoman Empire was actually going to be confined to an area much smaller than modern day Turkey. And this indeed did engender a great deal of animosity. A final treaty was formed on August 10th because when this earlier treaty was presented to the Turks, they basically said, nah, we're not doing it. We're not going to accept it. This was basically forced on them. And as you'll see, the result was the Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal, who was called Ataturk and the father of modern Turkey. He also was more of a secular leader than a theological leader. He was Muslim, of course, but his emphasis was not on the religious nature of Turkey as much as it was on the secular nature. But they fought primarily against Greece, and there was great tragedy that occurred as a result of that fighting. It wasn't until 1924 that there was finally a resolution to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And of note is that nearly 1.3 million ethnic Greeks forced to leave Asia Minor, and about 500,000 Turks left Greece. This is a great exchange of population, and it wasn't necessarily pleasant. It was something that involved a lot of misery on the part of everyone, particularly in trying to resettle. We often talk about the cost of the war, and we do this primarily by talking about the number of people killed and wounded during the course of the conflict. And then over here is an estimate of the economic or financial cost, which again is hard to interpret, even if you try to convert those dollars into modern dollars. But the point I think that bears emphasis is that in looking this over and considering what the outcome of the war was in these particular dynamics, look at the population of the world at 1900 and look at the population of the world in 2000. And you see this incredible escalation in the population of the world in the last 100 years, despite the enormous losses, and they were enormous, that took place during World War I, the Spanish flu, World War II, the various civil wars that took place, and so on and so forth. It's astounding to consider what human beings as a species were able to weather, were able to survive over the course of probably one of the most brutal 100 years in human history. It is just extraordinary. And that the recovery of these various populations throughout the world, both economically, not just biologically, but economically, again, is extraordinary. I don't know that there's a good explanation for why, but to me, it is just an extraordinary element. This is the new Europe. This is what it looked like after the war. You'll notice that Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Austria, all previously part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including areas down here, that's all been changed, torn up. Poland is now recreated once again. Prussia separated from the rest of Germany. This is the Danzig corridor in order to have an outlet to the Baltic, so the Poles could trade. The borders of the USSR have been pressed back to some degree with territory lost to Poland, but not a lot. This is still largely ethnic Russia. You notice that the Ukraine is still incorporated into the USSR as a result of the Civil War. And the various Baltic countries up through here, including Finland, had maintained some level of independence. So the outcome, the transformation, was predominantly in Europe, but there were effects that were felt worldwide. And I addressed some of those. I'm sorry, let me go back to this. In my last lecture, when I talked about the difference between ideology and nationalism, and what I want to do is just take a few minutes as we near the end of this last lecture, and hopefully if any of you have questions or comments, I leave time for that to be laid out in front of all of us. I want to lay out the following things. The emphasis, I hope, that will go back to one of the first slides I mentioned about the goals of this lecture, this whole series. And that is that we now have two really new concepts that are going to influence the world for the next 100+ years. The first is the concept of total war. Unlike all the previous conflicts, this particular one engaged everybody in the fight, very directly involved, to the extent that among the warring countries, the civilian population was considered in many ways as much as a combatant as the frontline soldiers, and therefore could be targeted quite deliberately in order to undermine the ability of the frontline soldiers to perform their duties. The initiatives that we look at were particularly propaganda, but even more deliberately, there were specific military attacks against civilian targets. I showed this in the Zeppelin raids against England, and what I didn't show were some of the bombing raids carried out by the Allies against Germany. There was a great emphasis on total mobilization of the home front to support what was going on at the front. The utilization of resources was profound, to the point that a number of the countries, particularly in 1916 and moving into 1917, were approaching famine, some of them really getting into the depths of it. Indeed, in Russia in particular, in 1917, the situation was so bad that there were a large number of deaths due to the famine itself. People were reduced to stripping bark off trees or gathering up moss and other things in order just to try to sustain themselves. And some of the stories that one can read of that time are really pretty profound, dramatic, and troubling. But this was part of the total war concept. The second part was the shift to ideology from traditional power politics. Now, France and Britain, Italy, to some extent Germany, Austria-Hungary, had somehow still maintained the idea of power politics as the central focus for what they hoped to achieve in the war. That is, to control certain territory or certain economic principles, or sustain themselves as a dominant power that could influence international affairs one way or another. But with the introduction, particularly, of Wilson's 14 points, and with the rise of the socialist communist movements that were permeating European society at all levels, the shift now became ideology. That is, that there's a certain kind of truth about how the world is supposed to work. For Wilson, to put it in somewhat limited terms, not being entirely fair, this was an idea that he emphasized with the phrase, make the world safe for democracy. There was nothing at the start of 1914 inherent in any of the policies offered by any of the warring parties that was looking to change the mechanisms of government in particular, to force, say, just to use an extreme example, the United States to adopt a monarchy under German rule. I mean, that just wasn't in the cards, ever. Germany wasn't looking to do that to France. They weren't looking to do that to Russia, and so on. That was power politics. But when you introduce the concept of make the world safe for democracy, you have changed the dynamic. And as I showed in the 14 points, you also found emphasis that said ethnic groups deserved a voice in their government where they had been suppressed before. This particular idea, while Wilson thought in part it applied primarily to Europe, was actually global in its influence. The word didn't stop in Europe. It's not as though in Africa or in Indochina, where the French had strong colonies, or through all of the rest of Malaya and Indonesia and so on. These were all taken over by European powers. And the people learned about those things and said, what justification is there for you to suppress us? Coupled with that, in some ways coupled, but also distinct, was the rise of socialism and communism. And the idea that the suppression of the proletariat by the capital elite, the governmental elite, the aristocracy as readily identifiable, was something which needed to be overturned. And it wasn't just to be overturned in a country, it was to become global. That meant that every nation state was at risk of having its proletariat, however defined, rise up and get rid of them and destroy their particular political agenda or organization. And ultimately, this would have profound effects on their economy and everything else. Those particular ideas were the consequence of a transformation in power politics, which became the norm as you get into the 20s, 30s, and 40s and beyond. And to me, that is one of the most profound consequences of World War I. Yes, the casualties were heavy. Yes, there was great loss of treasure and life and readjustment of political boundaries. But in comparison to the rise of ideology, looking at the transformation of the world's population from 1900 to 2000, you see something very different in human affairs, something which has not occurred before. And now it's going to influence pretty much everything that's going to happen for the next nearly 100 years. So that's why I think this particular area of study is important. There's a whole side of this that relates to the development of military strategy, operational and tactical initiatives, the integration of various arms, the importance of technological developments and how the war is conducted. And I hope that I've highlighted to some degree the enormous complex responsibilities that senior commanders had to manage, as well as senior political operatives at the time, and how those people either lost position because they weren't able to maintain their goals or sustain them in particular ways. Again, ripe for study. As I mentioned earlier, I hope that you have enjoyed these lectures. I hope that you feel it's been worth your time. I will be happy to answer any questions you have, and I thank you for the honor of being able to present it.
You for a wonderful.
Thank you. Michael,
Yes.
Thank you. by the
do
way.
you have any comments on the resurrection of the idea that realpolitik is coming back into play, especially in the relationships with China and the US,
Yes.
framed as competition for resources and not, you know, that ideology, human rights or something, or just sugarcoating on grabbing resources.
I think you've hit an excellent point, and I think that's particularly true in the sense that if we look at communist China, we look at Russia, while there's an ideology that governs the internal functions of those countries, I don't think they're as interested in promoting communism as an ideology and the uprising of the proletariat against all the other nations to the degree that was true in the 20s and 30s, 40s, and so on. What I think also is true is that we, and I use the word in the West, still make an error of sorts, though we have been learning some very painful lessons from Vietnam through Iraq and Afghanistan, that promoting our so-called ideals of democracy, however we wish to define it, do not work in countries where you try to impose it. And I think we're learning painful lessons about that. I think that the world, in a sense, and again, this is really a projection, and I apologize if anyone feels offended by it. I think that getting back to power politics is probably in everyone's best interest because it introduces a level of realism into what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you, Dr. Kissinger.
So my apologies to those who feel otherwise, you know, and we could certainly I can stick around and we can argue with each other about it if we like. But I think you've hit an interesting point, and that is that we're beginning to understand the limitations of ideology. And we've experienced its dangers, both within a country, as demonstrated in what happened in the Soviet Union and China when they became communist in name and function, compared to where we are today.
There seems to be, to me also, Tom, not just resources, but territory, just like the old days. And the ethnic sort of homogenization of the territory with the motherland, shall we call it. That is to say, Russia trying to take over the Crimea because even though they're not Russians down there, they're Ukrainians, they are still part of what Russia has always considered its territory. But more importantly, in China, in the South China Sea area, where they want to, what they seem to be doing is building a clamp around Formosa, which is what they definitely consider their own territory, the Chinese do. And some parts of Vietnam are likely to be considered vulnerable to them as well.
Right. Yeah, and again, the idea of resources is important, but I think the shift away from promoting your ideology is important.
Yeah, but it's more ethnic, it's more racial.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
the motivating factor more than anything else. And where they see weakness as well, because in the smaller states that have that ethnic match, they consider there's a fifth column there among those who are at least tired of their own little local government and would rather have a bigger one, sure.
Right.
For economic reasons.
Judy, you have your hand up. You
Yes,
want to press your space bar?
Are we still looking for a poem?
Oh, okay.
Because I didn't know, I wasn't in on the beginning of the search, but I did
Okay.
find the Pro Patria Mori, Dulce et Decorum Est, which was written by Wilfred Owen. And,
Okay, Winfred Owen, yeah.
Yeah. So I just thought I would mention that.
Thanks. Karen, you have your hand up?
Yes, I didn't realize there were so many treaties after World War One.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting. Each of them had to have a separate treaty.
Now, what was the difference with World War II? Still a world war, and I don't believe there were that many treaties. Did they all combine together, or things just advanced?
I think the issue in World War II was a bit different in that Germany had already taken over Czechoslovakia and Austria. So there was a large landmass, if you will, that was considered under the control of a single government. Italy had to sign a different treaty, if you will. That happened after the United States had invaded at Salerno. Japan was an entity which had in itself very few allies, so that once Japan surrendered, basically, I don't recall if there were separate treaties with some of the governments which had given themselves over to Japan. Rather, I think they just said, we're no longer part of this because they'd been coerced. In this situation, it was different, where these countries joined in specifically as separate entities, as allies, and therefore had to be dealt with separately, as each government was sovereign within its own political borders.
Also, did the tanks in World War II make so much more of a difference? Did the more developed tanks change the nature of warfare? They could travel really fast through countries.
It had a lot to do with it But the interesting part, again, if this ever should get to that stage, is that when Germany attacked France in 1940, mechanically, its tanks were inferior to many French tanks. What changed was the doctrine and the implementation of tank warfare with particular goals that were not seen as lessons learned by the French. The French derived different lessons. When Germany attacked Russia, its tanks were technologically, in many ways, inferior to those the Russians had, particularly the T-34 and the KV-1, to use technical examples. And the Germans were outnumbered by far by the number of tanks which Russia possessed. But again, it had to do with doctrine and the integration of various arms, particularly the use of artillery and air power to promote the use of those tanks. And it's very interesting that in the Eastern Front in particular, the German tanks were often technologically inferior through much of the war. The development of the Panther tank and the Tiger tank later on represented relatively small proportions of the overall German forces and armored units that confronted the Russians later on. So there's an interesting set of issues there. And indeed, again, looking at just the technology, the American Sherman tank was inferior, that is tank versus tank, compared to many of the German tanks. And there were reasons why that was the way it was. But due to technology in the form of logistical support, tank recovery, repair, and things of this nature, the American armored forces, although their tanks were considered somewhat inferior, actually performed surprisingly well. A lot of the issues that we hear about World War II, and the comment that the Sherman tank was a Ronson, to use the term of a famous lighter that you'd light cigarettes with because of the way it would brew up due to gasoline, kind of skewed the numbers when you actually look at how many American tanks were utterly lost to German tanks. The most were lost to anti-tank guns and to mines rather than to German tanks, just as an example. So the lessons that each country drew were somewhat different, and technology was only a portion of it. You could have inferior equipment, but if your doctrine was better, you could accomplish a great deal.
Thank you.
All right. Well, you've all been extraordinarily patient. I would just simply ask if you are willing to provide feedback to the Lyceum. I know I think there's a survey or something you fill out, but any comments you wish to address to me directly, my email is mbagdasarian@gmail.com. It's very straightforward. I'm happy to deal with it. If you send me personal, insults, I probably won't respond quickly, but any suggestions or recommendations. One thing I realized in going through all this, I will say this parenthetically, is I sometimes have way too many maps to illustrate the same thing. And there needs to be some paring down of that to give you the information that's most relevant to the lecture. So I apologize for that.
It's unfortunate that you can't get the same map drawer using the same color schemes and so on to illustrate the various areas and functions and battles and so on.
Right.
Because jumping from one color scheme to another is very confusing trying to find them.
Yeah, I'm not very good at that.
No, it's not your fault. That's anyway, listen,
Thank you.
I forgot to mention at the beginning of this that the entire lecture series has been recorded
Yes.
with large gaps at the beginning, unfortunately, due to my own non-wokeness, as my said. Tonight I spilled a whole glass of wine all over the table. Dealing with that, but we've got almost all of it tonight. So,
Well,
or
well, Michael, I will say in your defense, you have not mistaken the map for the territory.
Thank you.
Thank you so
that's
much.
right.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thank you
Alright.
so much. Michael.
Onward to World War II next year. Huh?
Prelude to World War II. World War II doesn't make any sense unless we look at the 20s and 30s.
Oh, absolutely,
right.
absolutely.
And the 20s and
One of my
30s then.
favorite authors.
20s and 30s.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
Here we
Okay.
go.
Thank you.
I do.
Thank you all.
Good night.
You and
Good
I
night.
all